Man Miloje was a man made of stone. He was nearly 70 years old, yet he looked as if the mountain itself had carved him. His face was etched with deep furrows, scars of sun and frost. His hands gnarled like the twisted roots of an ancient oak. He lived in total isolation. His cabin, a weathered, decaying hut of mud and unhewn logs, clung to the very edge of a precipice, miles away from the nearest soul. No electricity, no telephone, only an old wood-burning stove, a flickering kerosene lamp, and his mountain dog, a sharp lanin axe named Rex. Miloje had been a shepherd his entire life. It was the only world he knew. Until exactly 20 years ago, when the mountain took everything from him. It was an autumn unlike any that even the oldest villagers could remember. On that cursed day, 20 years ago, the sky above the mountain did not turn gray, it turned a sickly dark purple. The clouds hung so low they literally swallowed the treetops. The air, it smelled of sulfur and static electricity. At that time, Miloje had a flock of over 120 sheep, his pride. Leading the flock was the alpha ram, a massive black beast with horns as thick as a man's arm. Miloje called him Krinya, the Black One. Krinya was no ordinary animal. He had a temper sharper than a wolf's. And around his neck, on a thick leather strap, Krinya wore a bell. It wasn't a common tin clapper you'd find at a market. It was an ancient, heavy bronze bell, cast more than 100 years ago. That bell had a specific sound. It didn't just ring, it struck, a blunt, heavy echo that cut through the thickest fog and the fiercest wind. Whenever Miloje heard that dull thud of bronze, he knew exactly where Krinya was. And where Krinya was, the whole flock followed. But that night, the storm that struck was not natural. There was no thunder, there was no rain, only a terrifying, savage wind that tore trees out by their roots, and a thick black fog that rolled across the earth like quicksand. Miloje tried to drive the flock into the pen, but the animals had gone mad. Not from the fear of the storm, they were driven mad by something else. They began to rear up, bleating in pure animal terror, turning their heads toward the dense black forest. And before Miloje could close the gate, the flock broke through the fence. Every single one. 120 sheep stampeded straight into the darkest shadows of the pine forest, swallowed by that sickly fog. Miloje ran after them. He called to them until his throat bled. He ran blindly through thorns and over rocks, listening for that heavy sound of Krinya's bell. He followed that sound for hours. The bell echoed through the forest, deeper and deeper, leading him toward the cliffs. And then the sound stopped, as if someone had cut it with a knife. Miloje never found them. They searched for days, for weeks, hunters, gendarmes, neighbors from the valley below. Not a single trace was found, not a tuft of wool, not a single bone. It was as if the mountain itself had opened up and swallowed them alive. From that day on, Miloje never raised another flock. He remained alone in his cabin, waiting for death in the silence, haunted by guilt and by that terrifying silence that remained after they were gone. Return to the present. Night, late November. Half a meter of snow had already fallen, trapping Miloje's cabin in an icy grip. The old man sat on a low wooden stool by the glowing stove. His dog, Rex, lay curled at his feet, breathing steadily. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled its familiar, lonely song, battering the wooden shutters of the tiny windows. It was a night like hundreds of others in the mountains. Until, at exactly 3 in the morning, the wind suddenly stopped. A dead, heavy silence took hold, a silence so deep that Miloje could hear his own heartbeat drumming in his ears. Even the fire in the stove seemed to quiet down, the flames retreating. And then he heard it. From the distance, from the direction of that black, endless pine forest, a sound carried through the air. Miloje stopped breathing. The hand holding the iron fire tong stayed frozen in midair. Rex, a massive sharp Laniak who feared no bear, suddenly raised his head. He didn't bark. The fur on his back bristled, and a low, panicked whimper escaped his throat. The dog cowered under the table, trembling like a leaf. Miloje stood up slowly. He felt the cold sweat soaking through his wool sweater. He knew that sound. It was the old, heavy bronze bell. Krenya's bell. Reason told him it was impossible. 20 years had passed. The bell had likely rotted away in some pit along with the bones of that cursed beast. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe old age and solitude were finally taking their toll on his mind. But the sound was there. Completely real. It wasn't ringing hurriedly, like an animal grazing. It rang in a perfect, steady rhythm. One blunt strike every 5 seconds. As if someone or something was walking very slowly and deliberately through the deep snow, heading straight for his cabin. Fear is a powerful thing, but despair is much worse. Miloje did not want to die in fear, hiding in his cabin like a mouse. If death had come for him in the form of ancient ghosts, he wanted to look it in the eye. With heavy, trembling hands, he pulled on his thick sheepskin coat. From the wall, he took down his old double-barreled shotgun. He cracked it open and slid in 2 heavy lead slugs meant for the largest of beasts. He took his gas lantern, lit it, and threw open the heavy wooden door. The winter struck his face like the blade of an axe. Outside, there was only pitch-black darkness. Only the snow under the lantern's light shimmered like shattered glass. Miloje took his first step into the snow. His dog stayed inside, refusing to follow, howling softly from the darkest corner of the room. The old man headed toward the forest. He waded through the deep drifts, his shotgun gripped tight in frozen hands. The lantern cast long, sinister shadows across the trees. The bare branches looked like twisted skeleton fingers reaching out, trying to catch him by the hair. Every step was a struggle.
The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the heavy, rhythmic striking of the bronze bell, getting closer and closer.
The sound was now incredibly close. It was coming from a small hollow known as the Wolf's Den, hidden among the densest pines. Miloje slowed his pace. That's when he began to smell it. It wasn't the clean scent of mountain winter or ozone. It was a stifling, heavy stench, the smell of wet, rotting wool mixed with the odor of an open grave and stale blood. It was so intense that Miloje had to press his hand over his nose and mouth just to keep from retching. He reached the edge of the hollow. His heart drummed against his ribs as if trying to break free. He raised the lantern high above his head, illuminating the small snow-covered clearing before him. And then he saw them. Through the pale yellow light, in the darkness and the fog, silhouettes began to emerge. Dozens of them. They stood in a perfect circle, completely motionless in the snow. For a split second, Miloje's mind felt a surge of relief. The flock, he thought, my flock has returned. But that relief instantly withered, turning into pure, paralyzing, escalating horror. The proportions of those shadows were all wrong. These were not sheep. They didn't stand on four legs, nor were they hunched toward the ground, searching for grass beneath the snow. The silhouettes stood upright, on two hind legs. They were nearly 2 meters tall, clothed, or rather covered in that thick, matted black wool that hung from them in stinking, rotting tatters. Their front legs, their arms hung by their sides, far too long, with sharp hooves that cut through the frozen air. They didn't move. They just stood there in the silence. Then, from the center of that dark, inhuman crowd, a single silhouette stepped forward. It moved with a heavy, swinging gait. It was him, Krønja, but it was no longer an animal. His body was distorted, his spine broken and forced upright so he could walk on 2 legs. Around his thick, rotting neck hung that ancient, heavy bronze bell. Krønja raised his massive head toward Miloje. His eyes were completely white, glazed over with slime. There wasn't a trace of an animal in them. These were eyes that had seen the very bottom of hell. Miloje raised his shotgun. His hands were shaking so violently he couldn't aim. "Get back," the old man whispered, his voice cracking. "Go back to where you came from." Then the worst happened. Krønja didn't bleat. He didn't make an animal sound. His snout, with pieces of rotting flesh falling from it, stretched into something that resembled a smile. And from his throat, cutting through the night, came a deep, raspy, and perfectly human voice. "Take us home, Miloje." At that exact moment, every single one of those 120 creatures in the circle took a perfectly synchronized, heavy step forward, toward him. Miloje didn't consciously pull the trigger. The shotgun fired on its own from his convulsively clenched fingers. A deafening blast echoed through the forest, followed by a flash of fire from the barrels. He didn't even look to see if he hit anything. He dropped both the gun and the lantern into the deep snow, turned on his heel, and began to run. He ran like never before in his life. He waded through the drifts on the verge of a total heart attack. Behind him, in the absolute darkness, he heard the sound that would forever shatter his mind. It wasn't the gallop of 4 legs. He heard the thumping of hundreds of heavy, 2-legged footsteps stomping through the snow behind him, followed by the hellish, frenzied clanging of that heavy bronze bell. That morning, neighbors from the village below noticed that no smoke was rising from Miloje's chimney. A few young men rode snowmobiles up to his cabin. They found him inside. The door was barricaded with a heavy wardrobe and a table. Whisper. Miloje was sitting in the corner, holding his dead dog in his arms. The sharp Laninak's heart had burst from pure terror. The old man's hair was now completely white. He didn't speak. His eyes were wide, vacant, staring at a single point on the wooden door. The door, from the outside, was completely shredded with deep, sharp marks from thick hooves. The villagers say that old Miloje was never seen sleeping again. He was taken to an institution where even today, years later, he sits awake every night. He covers his ears with his hands and screams that someone in the hallway is ringing an old, heavy bell. So, my friends, the next time darkness falls in the mountains and you think you hear the sound of a village bell through the howling wind, do not go outside to see who is coming. Close the door, lock the latches, and pray to God that the flak simply passes by your house.